This book is so good that I love every part of it. Understanding emotions. I just read about romanticism. Now I'm going to read about the following part about the cultural influence of a person. There are several windows onto culture. One is historical, is to read a document from the past. Another is from travelers, such as anthropologists, who bring back news of the contemporary cultures different from our own. Yet, another is by studying socialization, how children acquire the beliefs and skills of society. In this book, we will take our cultural history to be that of North America and Europe, since that is the tradition in which the authors of this book have been brought up and about which we have first-hand knowledge. To understand emotions, your own, those of the other people you know well, those of people in different societies, you need to locate yourself within your own cultural tradition. Since the majority of readers of this book will be North American and European, we begin with Western culture, but it is only a starting point, and a crude one at that, because Europe and America house a great many cultures. We do not think our culture preeminent. If we were Japanese or Indian, we could write this chapter and some other sections of the book differently. This is no fixed point on which to stand outside the cultural tradition, nor are we arguing that cultural contradicts rationality. Rather, among the many values that any human society can adopt, some are chosen rather than others. Nor are we arguing that culture contradicts tradition. There's no fixed point on which to stand outside cultural tradition, nor are we arguing that culture contradicts rationality. Rather, among the many values that any human society can adopt, some are chosen rather than others. For instance, we have among the many values that any human society can adopt, some are chosen rather than others. For instance, we have suggested that North America is still in many ways romantic. In the last 20 years, environmentalist concerns have become strong. They fit closely with romantic attitudes and values affirming the natural. But this does not mean these concerns are irrational. East and West. Let us consider the emotional atmosphere of the non-Western culture, Japan, which is based like the Western one on the money economy. Differences are not due to different degrees of industrial progress, literacy, or such like. Nevertheless, your American and Japanese emotional climate do differ. The main contrast noted both by Western and Japanese observer is in the nature of the self. In the West, we conceptualize the self as the I self, and the autonomous entity, the source of decisions, thoughts and actions, as well as the center of experience of solution. This self is separate from other selves. Let us consider the emotional atmosphere of the non-Western society, Japan, which is based like the Western one on a money economy. Different are not due to differences degree of industrial progress. The main contrast noted both by Western and Japanese observers is the nature of the self. In the Western, we conceptualize the self as I self, an autonomous entity, the source of decision, thoughts, and actions, as well as the center of experience of emotions. This self is separate from other selves. In this society, it is important to become independent, to assert the self, to contend against other selves, if necessary. By contrast, in Japan and many non-Western cultures, although this account is no doubt oversimplified, many commentators have described the self as a we self, an I self and a we self, deriving from connections with family, colleagues, and the social group. It is more important to fit in with others and live in harmony with them, lest we think that the independent I, deriving authenticity from its individual desires and emotions, is natural. We should reflect that this emphasis on the natural is itself part of the Western cultural heritage. In terms of world cultures, it is the individualistic self that is unusual. In every society, children develop a sense of themselves as physically separate from the world. Post that this physical aspect should be called the ecological self. In addition, people everywhere probably have a self of a private mental life, including a stream of conscious thoughts, feelings, and dreams, but some other aspects of the self differ and affect emotional life. With an interdependent or we self, thoughts and feelings focus not on being separate, but on overlapping with others. Even in our individualistic society, you can get a sense of this. When you fall in love, you can experience the boundaries of yourself expanding to include the other person in your primary concerns and become more of a we than an I. Anger in the West is an emotion of independence and self-assertion. In Japan, although it is thought appropriate between people from different social groups, for instance, in the tradition of samurai warfare in feudal Japan, report that anger is considered highly inappropriate between relations or colleagues. By contrast, anger between Americans who know and like each other is relatively common and accepted. By means of people keeping diaries constructed like questionnaires, that incidents of anger occurred about once a week. Most concerned someone the subject knew and liked. Most subjects said the reason for their anger was to assert authority or independence, or improve their image. Found different effects of interpersonal anger in America and Japan from early life. The experimenters showed interesting toys to American and Japanese infants of 11 months, pairing each toy with the mother's voice expressing joy, anger, or fear, measuring the time it took for the infant to start moving towards the toy after hearing the mother's expression. American and Japanese infants were no different in how soon they moved after the sound of their mother's joyful or fearful voices. After their mothers have spoken in an angry voice, American infants started moving towards the toy at an average of 18 seconds later, but Japanese infants took significantly longer, an average of 48 seconds to start moving. Japanese babies were probably more inhibited by their mother's angry expression because these were rare events. Turning to a more emotional, positive emotion, in Japan there is an emotion, amin, for which there is no simple translation in English. Amin is an emotion of independence, arising from a kind of symbiosis from comfort in the other person's complete acceptance. It is not that this emotion is unrecognizable in other cultures, but that it lacks universal significance. In the West, it would be considered regressed. It is an emotion not of separateness, but of merged togetherness. Takes readers on what he calls a Cook's tour of emotions in different societies. He proposes that in some cultures, a particular emotion or cluster of emotions is recognized, has special names, and is the subject of social discussion. Such emotions are hypercognized. They were culturally emphasized. By contrast, certain emotions seem to occur rarely or not at all in some cultures. They are not conceptualized or commented upon. They were hypercognized. So emotions of dependence such as a me are hypercognized in Japan, hypercognized in hypo in American. In the West, our folk theory tends towards hypocognizance and the suppression of fear. One source for such theory is advice manuals for parents. Such manual published between, as well as popular literature aimed at children. Before 1900, 3 features stood out: warnings to parents about dangers of arousing fear in their children, silence on the object of dealing with children's fear, boys' stories aimed at inspiring courage in being ready to act properly despite fear. Then a change occurred. 20th century parents were told not only to avoid frightening their children as a disciplinary device, but also to master their own emotions. Separation from toddlers arose fears and to be avoided. Emotional climates. The term emotional climates, coined by D. Rudder, describes the mood of a cultural group or nation. It affects not only how one feels, but what and can't be done. For instance, in certain South and Central American countries, people have been subjected to climates of fear by random acts of assassination and disappearance. In such climates, distrust multiplies, cooperation ceases, even the interpretation of everyday objects change. A red traffic light, which would mean stop, may no longer mean stop because it is when one stops, then that one is an easy target for gunfire. In most industrialized countries, the prevailing climate is one of interpersonal cooperation, conducive to the activities of urban societies. For the most part, people who do not know each other interact peacefully. In this respect, Japanese and American cities are similar. If you, as a Westerner, never outside your own society, were transported to the middle of Tokyo with some travelers there, you would be surprised by the absence of graffiti or vandalism, pleased that there was no threat of mugging, surprised to see respectable young women walking alone without concern through the city at night. But much would be familiar. You could find your way, interact with people, and recognize much of what was going on. By contrast, if you were transported to a non-industrialized society, more would be unfamiliar. Much more than travelers' checks would be needed. Emotion on Infaluke. One of the non-industrialized societies that have been studied to understand its emotional life is a tiny Pacific atoll about 1/5 the size of New York Central Park, with a population of 430 people. It was visited for 9 months by Luz. She wrote that she wanted to see if and how it was possible for people to organize their lives in such a way as to avoid the problems that seemed to me to diminish American culture. In particular, its pervasive inequality of both gender and class and its violence. Ifluk is a highly independent society. People have come to rely on each other on this island, which has its highest point just a few yards above sea level, and where typhoons not infrequently sweep the huts away, destroy the taro gardens, and deplete fish in the lagoon. In her portrait of Ifluk, Luz has been successful in 3 important ways, the combination of which is unprecedented in the anthropological literature. First, she went specifically to study not kinship, not religion, not economic relations, but emotional life. Second, because of her cultural sensitivity and her skill as a writer, she has been able to give that Goethe has called a thick description not just of what emotions occur, but of the settings from which they arise with the cultural significance that derives from them. Thirdly, because none of us can become members of society of another culture in a short visit during adulthood, Luz does not describe how it feels to be an Ifluqian, but she developed another method. Instead of simply suffering from culture shock, she made use of it. She herself, as an American female at a particular point in historic time, by paying attention to misunderstandings that arose between her and the Ifluqian and their emotional effects, she saw how cultural rules operated both in her own society and that of Ifluk. Here is an illustration of the American I-self and the Ifluk we-self encountering each other. During her first weeks on the island, Luz asked some young woman visiting her hut, "Do you all want to come with me to get drinking water?" Their faces fell. Luz wrote that it was not till later that she realized that what has gone wrong. By addressing them as you, she had implied a separation between them and her own decision-making I-self. She wrote that a more correct form indicating the we-self would be something more like, "We'll go and get water now, okay?" implying that such a decision were collective. This woman is smiling as she makes an impromptu headdress for her small son, while she rests after grating coconut. This kind of socially responsive smiling is of a lower intensity and signals something different from excited happiness, of which people are suspicious because it implies ignoring the presence and needs of others. There are noticeable differences between social meanings of emotion in American and Ifluk. Taking the Ifluk curve, for instance, translate this as happiness, excitement. In American, people believe that it is a true self-evidence that there is a right to the pursuit of happiness. People do not think they have any right to the pursuit of happiness. They think instead that they should avoid it. It's not a contentment or interpersonal pleasantness which are common on a person feeling Kerr is likely to be too pleased with him or herself. It can lead to showing off, perhaps even to rowdiness, behavior of which the disapprove. So These kind of people, all tribal, in these people, they are all very humble. By contrast, one should say, gentle, calm, and quiet. One day, sitting with another woman, watched a 5-year dancing and make silly faces, showing a big girl, thought this little girl was rather cute. Don't smile at her, said her companion. She'll think that you are not Song, was indicating that the girl was approaching the age at which she should have social intelligence, the concern for others that is so valued. On this social intelligence, the woman was indicating another of the tenets of emotional life. If were to look some, the girl would stop displaying her and showing off. With its risk of misbehavior, the girl should sit quietly as good socially intelligent people do. So song is not anger as we in the West tend to experience it, arising from violence of the right. It is people's social duty to express some if they noticed anything that could disrupt social functioning. The difference between her own and the Ephraim culture caused Luz to make many social mistakes. One night, she was frightened by a man entering the doorless individual hut that she had negotiated for herself. Her screaming awakened her adopted family, who came to see what was wrong. They were asleep a yard and two away in their communal hut, with each one sleeping mat touching others, so that no one could be lonely. The man had fled, and the family laughed hilariously when they heard Luz had been alarmed by such an event. She said that she had been on the island long enough to know that men sometimes called on women at night for sexual rendezvous. But she had imported the American idea that an uninvited visit from a man inevitably meant harm. On Iflu, Luz says, although men may very occasionally seem frightening in public if drunk, so that others may feel that a disagreement might break out between them, interpersonal violence is virtually non-existent, and rape unknown. Hence, a night visitor means the very antithesis of fear. The incident became a topic of conversation, though no one could understand why she had been frightened. Luz sensed that her adopted mother showed some satisfaction in the story of the event, because although the anxiety that Luz displayed was inappropriate, it was anxiety. Her adopted mother thought that this meant that at last Luz was capable of showing this valued emotion. The most valued emotion, however, is Fargo, translated as compassion, love, sadness. It is the primary index of positive relationship, including those with children, relatives, and sexual partners. It is felt particularly when loved ones are in need in some way, including when they are absent, since in this absence they will be separated from those on whom they depend. It expresses the sadness that a needful state implies, and the compassion that has transmitted this sadness to the more resourceful one. Are there any human universal of emotions meant to show that emotions are different from those in American culture rather than natural? Part of the case are emotion universal is that they can be recognized cross-culturally. On emotions during her visit to Ifluk, such as her smile when she watched the little girl make silly faces and her fear when a man came into her hut at night, was recognized by her host, and she recognized the emotions of she saw the faces of the young woman fall when she asked if they wanted to get water, and she made translations of emotional concepts of her English-speaking readers. The question is, how fundamental are the similarities? How radical the difference? Partly, it is a matter of emphasis. In reading and thinking for this book, we have concluded that although there are substantial differences in emotional life in different cultures, and although in some cultures some emotions are hypercognized while others are hypocognized, emotional communities among people are larger than the differences. Differences in elicitor and interpretation in different cultures. Like other emotions, jealousy depends on some universal characteristics. Suggests that this universal is that people become jealous when something they value very much and which has been harder to achieve is threatened by an interloper. So for most Westerners, deeply held values and beliefs are threatened by sexual infidelity. For total men, comparable values are invested in their firstborn child. Sexual intercourse is not private through marriage, and these deep beliefs are not, therefore, threatened by extramarital relationships. Comparisons of how emotions are elicited in different cultures, one that else ended as investigating whether there may be some basic emotions they started with 6 terms derived from American: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and with 6 corresponding emotion terms. There are evidence that in Malay there were clusters of concepts around each of these terms. Different elicitors and in different cultures. Although some emotions, for example, fear on meeting on a bear or wild pig, might be universal, others might be culturally specific. Some institutions in one society have no equivalent in another. Prison is seen as barbarous by members of some society, and without police and prisons, the emotions associated with them could not occur. More subtle are emotions like jealousy. In the West, jealousy tends to be felt when the sexual attention of a primary partner turns towards someone else. It is hard, perhaps impossible, to find societies in which jealousy does not occur at all, but at the same time, social arrangements in different societies are various. Points out, in Western society, marriage is a social key to establishing one's adult status, economic security, housing, rearing of children, adult companionship, and sex. A sexual interloper threatens this whole structure. So in Western society, such a person is jealously feared and hated. In some other, more clan-based societies, however, the sense of we-self is a more extended cooperative effort to support everyone, including the elderly. Child rearing is distributed among several people. Adult companionship derives from many relatives, and the extramarital relationship, recreational sex, may be customary. So, for a sexual interloper would not threaten such a larger and important structure. Display rules. One way of dealing why sexual interloper threatens the Western world. Because it points out, in Western culture, marriage is a social key to establishing one's adult status, economic security, housing, rearing of child, adult companionship. Okay, so in Western world, marriage means so much things, so they would become jealous of elope. Display rules. One way of dealing both with universal and cultural variation has been postulated by Ekman in her neurocultural theory, the best known of the so-called two-factor theories of emotion, which derive from Tompkins' proposal. One factor is universal and biological. There is a small set of fundamental emotions, such as happiness and anger, which can be experienced. If unimpeded, they are expressed naturally. Emotional programs that include smile, frowns, and so on. The other factors is specific to culture, a set of display rules regulating when and where such expression should be intensified, suppressed, neutralized, or masked. The basis of the display rule idea is a much excited experiment. The report results were that when they were alone in phase 1, American and Japanese subjects made similar facial expressions of fear and disgust at the same point in the films. But in phase 3, facing the interviewers and the screen, the Japanese subjects smiled more and inhabited the negative expressions more than the Americans. When viewed in slow motion, the videotapes showed Japanese subjects beginning to make a facial expression of fear or disgust, but then making it with a social smile, in which they turned the corners of their lips upward. Is critical of these conclusions. He argued that to be convincing, the experimenters would have needed evidence that the Japanese subjects experienced the same emotions as the Americans while watching the film clip in phase 3, while exaggerating smiles and suppressing negative expressions. Prefers explanation that the Japanese subjects were more polite. They tended to look more at the interviewer rather than the film, and they smiled more at the interviewer. Other researchers have postulated cultural rules for suppressing emotions, but they have derived their conclusion quite differently. Among the Chowang, a small group of Aboriginal hunters and shifting cultivators in Malaysia, concluded that prohibitions exist against all emotions with the exception of fear and shyness. Instead of emotions prompting people to act in this way or that, as seems to occur in many societies, have explicit behavior rules about what to do and what not to do in different circumstances. Penalties of severe bodily ills are believed to occur if rules are broken. The result is a society in which how well says the people, though confident in their interactions with the environment, are emotionally inexpressive with each other. They rarely use gestures of any kind, and their faces just register little change as they speak and listen. Howell concluded that emotions and their display are suppressed, and one gains the impression also that suppression involves the emotion of fear of consequences of expressing an emotion, though other anthropologists suggest that emotions are not a salient part of life among the Chowang because they are hypocognized. They simply may not occur at all frequently. The third category of cross-cultural distinction is the most radical. It is that of cultural construction, the idea that because they derive from human meanings which are necessarily cultural, emotions are cultural products, just like languages or works. This word is very interesting. As all emotions are all emotions cultural products, there are certainly some human universals working on two legs using language and tools, but perhaps there are no universal emotions with equivalence across cultures. Just in Chinese culture, if you scold someone, a Chinese parents, the Chinese would feel insulted. But if you scold a Chinese government, some stupid Chinese would be feel insulted. But if you scold Thailand's parents or Thailand's government, maybe they would just laugh. Passionate love. If this postulate is among the most controversial in cross-cultural studies of emotions, the difficulty with coming to any considered judgment is that of universities and relativists focused on different evidence and on different interpretations of the same evidence. It is a wide-ranging survey of concept of emotion in different cultures have concluded that there are cultural differences in such concepts, but also strong cross-cultural strong. Most anthropology research is on concept. If we were to lose, we're indicating a cultural different, specific, passionate sexual love. This love, sexual, was something like the sexual attraction, adoration, exclusive. This love is the most valued emotion in the USA. It occurs only between actual or potential sexual partners. It is not money, not power, not youth or health, but love in marriage that was found in Friedman's survey of 100,000 Americans to be what they thought was most strongly associated with happiness. Passionate sexual love is culturally widespread. Propose that it consists of sexual attraction with a biological core, perhaps involving increased levels of in the brain. It is experienced as joyful and energizing, and it is enacted as courtship. Have surveyed anthropological literature to see whether either in the writings of anthropologists or in the folklore there was evidence of this kind of love in the sample of 186 cultures described in 250 books and articles. They dropped 19 cultures from their survey because the writing provided no evidence about courtship, marriage, or sexual behavior, and one on which the two authors could not agree. The remaining 100 societies, they counted the kind of love as being present. If the writer made a distinction between love and lust and noted the presence of at least one of the following attributes of love occurring within the first 2 years of a couple meetings, irrespective of whether they married or not, personal anguish or longing, love songs and the like, elopement due to mutual affection, indigenous accounts of passionate love, the anthropologist affirmation that love occurred. Falling in love. The European idea of falling in love involves the attribute that used in their coding, but arguably it is more distinctive. Western cultures seem to have taken the universal pattern and embellished it further. Here, for instance, in a newspaper story like an anthropologist report from home. On Monday, this man and this woman, total strangers, boarded a train at San Francisco and sat down across the aisle from each other. Johnson didn't cross the aisle until Wednesday, but his bride said, "I'd already made up my mind to say yes if he asked me to marry him. We did most of the talking with our eyes," Johnson explained. Thursday, the couple got off the train in Oklahoma with plans to be married because they would need to have the consent of the bride's parents if they were married in Nebraska. They crossed the river to Counter Bluffs, Iowa, where they were married Friday. This story is striking because it so closely represents a Western culture idea. They are completely strangers, never talk with I. Showed it to a sample of American culture, 40% of them said they had had experiences conforming to the ideal embodied in the story. A further 40% said their experiences of love definitely did not conform to it, basing their responses on an unfavorable attitude to this idea plus any single departure they had felt from it. In responding in this way, they too indicated that they were influenced by this idea. Medieval courtly love. Love of this kind, meeting with a stranger, the special experience of falling in love, committing to the other as the core of adult life, rearrangement of all other plans and relationships is more specific than the pattern found culturally. In this form, it may not always be seen with us. One appealing account is that of the Western version of falling in love, starting its development in medieval Europe across Atlantic, was eagerly taken up in Hollywood and only more lately emerged as such striking forms of the encounter between on the train San Francisco. According to this account, the germ of Western idea of falling in love was courtly love, creating in province in the 11th century. The word courtly originally meant occurring at a royal court. The later meaning of courtship is derived from it. The idea was that a nobleman might fall in love with a lady and became her knight, devoting his life to her service, doing whatever she might wish, however dangerous and however trifling. Although conceived as a kind of aristocratic game, although it probably existed more in literary form than in real life, and although courtly love was by no means the only form in which love was described in medieval literature, the idea flourished. For several hundreds of years, it was the subject of some of Europe's greatest poetry. So it is an aristocratic court, but not for common people. Some people are skeptical that the idea of falling in love derived from the medieval courtly love. In the Hebrew tradition, for instance, in Genesis chapter 29, the story of Jacob and Rachel is told. Quotations are from quotation translation based on the Jacob met his cousin, the shepherd Rachel, and fell in love, seeing her as finely formed a vision. He asked her father for her hand, offering in turn to work for him for 7 years. Rachel's father agreed. The 7 years seemed in Jacob's eyes a few days. In the grasp of his love for her, when the 7 years were completed, a marriage was arranged. But that night it was the daughter Leah who was brought in fulfillment. The father of Leah and Ray explained to Jacob that it was the custom for the firstborn daughter to be married first. Finish the bridal work for this one, then we can give you the other also. This Jacob did, finishing the work for this one. Then Rachel's father gave his daughter Rachel to him as a wife. So he entered as well Rachel. He was in love with Rachel to him as a wife, so he entered as well. He worked with him 7 more years, starting again. Here is a story of perceived beauty, of strong preference, of a waiting period with arduous work to complete, of the gift by the father into lifetime lifetime marriage, certain elements were comparable to some of the medieval stories of knights and ladies, and also to some more recent Western traditions. All of the same, some wise people have been something distinctive in post-medieval Western love. Some people would never have fallen in love if they had never heard of love. Maybe you think that they go too far. Perhaps what they mean is that in each culture there were some universal elements and also something quite distinctive. In Europe and America, a really good job of falling in love is thought to happen suddenly, unexpectedly, involuntarily. The state engenders altruistic feelings, including the other within the boundaries of a we self. It enables a couple to overcome social difficulties and allows them to break previous ties. Rambels, cited by Frida, has found in a Dutch survey that in addition, the lovers must be open to this experience, and that after the initial meeting, there needs to be a period when fantasies can build. Okay. Then, at a sign of acknowledgement from the other, which, as between Skinner, can be as insubstantial as a meaningful look, and the people fall in love. Survey that in addition, the lovers must be open to this experience, and that after the initial meeting there must be a period where fantasies can build, a sign of acknowledgement for the other, which as between as can be as insubstantial as a meaningful look. In Love as a Transitional Social Role argues that falling in love, like many emotions, acts as a temporary social role. It provides an outline script for the role. It provides an outline of script for the role of lover, in which it is permissible for other social roles. It is suspended, for instance, in relation to parents or to former loved ones. The emotion in love accomplishes a transition from one structure of social relationships to another. Had to cross a state border to Iowa, where they did not require the constant. Argues that falling in love, like many emotions, acts as a temporary social role. It provides an outline script for the role of lover, in which it is permissible for other social roles to be suspended, for instance, in relation to parents or to former loved ones. The emotion in love accomplishes a transition from one structure of social relationships to another. Even in its modern form, this Western idea has its contradictions, which perhaps is part of its charm, since each pair of lovers must meet the challenge of resolving this for themselves. The most pressing modern contradiction, which also shows the cultural function of this kind of love at its clearest, is that love, a rather temporary emotion arising on short acquaintances, must be formed into lifelong commitment. Now the idea is not adultery, though for some this is not excluded, and the original secrecy of this kind of love seems never far away. Opening of the bud of the rose is consummation. In marriage, both partners is enthralled to love, most enthralled for love. Mysteriously, the individual I, center of decisions, captain of the soul, comes to be part of the mutually constructed we. There follows cohabitation, economic interdependence, the raising of children. In Western culture, with its suspicion that there is something wrong with emotions, falling in love occurs as its most valued personal experience. The experience of passionate love may be universal, but this briefish emotion with its administration of fantasy as the basis for lifelong commitment in a two-adult family is probably not universal. In The brackish emotion with its admixture of fantasy as the basis of lifelong commitment. In the next chapter, emotions are strongly affected by cultural ideals. In Western culture, emotion is rather distrusted as compared with reason, but at the same time, it is valued as a basis of authenticity. We can recognize in our cultural ideal more acutely by making comparisons both with historical material and with contemporary cultures. Historically, we in the West still seem to be living in an age of romanticism, which were lasted nearly 250 years, as compared with many other cultures worldwide. Present-day Euro-American culture is strikingly different in its emphasis on the autonomy of the individual and on the individual's rights. In such a culture, emotions like anger occur at the infringement of such rights. By contrast, many other cultures, including Japan, see the social group as the basis of selfhood. They define themselves in terms of duties and of we rather than I, and some emotions of togetherness are hypercognized. Many cultures suggest how emotions mediate relationships. Probably Westerners believe this too, because we know that love, happiness, sadness, anger all tend to concern our relationships with others. But our emphasis on individuality makes us also believe that emotions are individual states. Testing the basis of cultural situations that cause emotions, the name for emotions, and the expansiveness of vocabulary of emotions all vary cross-culturally. The question of how far emotions are universal and how far they are socially constructed by cultures is more difficult. Passionate love, for example, seems to occur in many cultures. Our own Western culture has a form of it, which is not only distinctive but has particular functions just in our kind of society. A very representative of Western culture about is Sartre, the Nobel Prize literature winner. They said that others is hell, and in Japanese, they said that they should rely on others.